Okay, so let's open our DAW. I personally did this in Ableton, but regardless of what digital audio workstation you're using, this will be applicable. When I was recording my samples, I would hit record in Ableton and let the track run for about a minute or so while striking whatever object I'm trying to sample. In this case, it was a knife. So you're gonna see here in this first track labeled Knives, I have multiple hits of the same knife, and they all sound a little different, and that's why I'm recording multiple samples all in a row. In some cases I might want a longer decay. A couple times I switched to a different drumstick because I wanted either a harsher or more dampened attack on the object. So what I'm going to do now is find a hit I like. That one sounds pretty good, and I'm gonna slice it up. And you want to make sure you get the full tail, the decay, just to make sure you're getting the full thing. And then on a new track, I'm gonna drag this sample down. And then what you want to do is make sure that this front attack of the sample is butted up as close to the beginning of the track as possible. So we're gonna zoom way, way, way in, because we don't want for there to be this delay between the initial start of the sample and where the computer is thinking of as the 0 point on our timeline. We want that sample to come in right away, otherwise in a drum kit it will feel like it's happening late. And maybe you're gonna want several different hits of the same instrument because they're all a little different, and it'll allow you to mix and vary them in a beat in interesting ways. So that's the process. We're gonna rinse and repeat to crop down our one-shot samples, but what about our loops? So first we want to make sure our loops are as close as possible to being on time, and this might be easier or harder depending on your experience with percussion instruments. I tried to record my samples to a 100 BPM click track. And as we can hear, even with the click track, there's some imperfections in the sample. Thankfully, Ableton's warp feature can correct these errors. And if you're unfamiliar, there are tons of resources online that can teach you how to use Ableton's warp feature. We're just gonna do a very quick overview. Just like with our one-shot samples, we wanna make sure that the first hit of our loop is pretty close to being right at the beginning of the timeline. Once that's done, we're gonna double click our clip and look down at it in the clip view, select the region we want to quantize, right click, quantize settings, and we're gonna quantize this to a 16th note grid. We don't want it to be too robotic, so I'm gonna set this at 50%. And now as we listen back, it'll be much closer to being on time. So you're gonna rinse and repeat that process for each of your loops. And then in your final file names, you want the BPM of the sample to be in the title. So I'm gonna call this Spade Loop 100 beats per minute. Now the last thing I want to demonstrate is how to use our one-shot samples to create melodic instruments using Ableton's Simpler plugin. The first thing you're going to want to do is create a MIDI track and then go into your browser and find Simpler. And then, as the name implies, you simply find the desired sample and drag it into Simpler. Some samples will lend themselves to being melodic instruments better than others. Things to consider will be whether the instrument has tone. So in this first example that I've picked, this knife doesn't ring out for very long and thus doesn't have much of a tonal quality to it. Whereas these samples of wine glasses being struck are much more tonal. So dig through the samples you've acquired and see what lends itself best to being a melodic instrument versus a percussive one.